Welcome to Mystic Sleep Tales, a place where gentle stories from another century carry you softly into rest. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know, where are you listening from this evening? Leave it quietly in the comments below. It is always wonderful to imagine these stories drifting across the world, reaching quiet rooms and soft pillows in places I have never seen. If these stories bring you comfort, you are welcome to subscribe and join us on these unhurried journeys through the past. There is no obligation, only an invitation to return whenever you need a place to rest. Now, it is time to settle in. Find your most comfortable position. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands go still. Close your eyes if they are not already closed. Take a slow, deep breath in through your nose. Hold it gently for a moment and release it slowly through your mouth. Feel the day begin to loosen its grip. One more breath, in slowly and out completely. Let everything you carried today, every errand, every conversation, every small worry, let it all drift away like smoke from a candle that has just been blown out. It was there. Now it is not, and you are here, safe, still, ready. Allow my voice to carry you somewhere far from now, somewhere old and quiet and warm, a place of leather and paper and candlelight, where the only sounds are the turning of pages and the whisper of snow against glass. A city built of stone and secrets, where books hold more than stories. They hold the truths that people were too frightened to speak aloud. We begin now. Sleep is already on its way. The knock came at 9:07 on a Tuesday evening in February, which was late enough to be unusual and early enough to be deliberate. Isobel Finch set down her needle and thread. She had been repairing the spine of a volume of Keats that had been poorly handled by its previous owner, and listened. The shop had been closed since 5:30. The sign on the door said so. The gas lamp in the window had been turned to its lowest setting, casting a dim amber glow onto the frosted glass that was more suggestion than invitation. No reasonable person would knock at this hour expecting service. The knock came again. 3 measured strikes against the wood, patient, unhurried, the knock of someone who had decided to wait however long waiting required. Isobel rose from her workbench and moved through the narrow corridor that connected the back workshop to the front of the shop. The air grew colder as she approached the door, the warmth of her coal stove surrendering to the February night that pressed against the building from every side. Through the frosted glass, she could see the shape of a man, tall, dressed in dark clothing, his silhouette blurred by the condensation and the snow that had been falling since mid-afternoon, and showed no inclination towards stopping. She opened the door 6 inches, enough to see him, not enough to invite him inside. The cold entered immediately, sharp and mineral, carrying the smell of wet cobblestones and coal smoke, and the particular iron tang of Edinburgh in winter. The man standing on her step was perhaps 50, though the gaslight made such estimations unreliable. He wore a solicitor's coat, well made but not ostentatious, and carried a leather case of the kind that contained documents rather than personal effects. His face was narrow, clean-shaven, marked by the particular quality of controlled patience that belongs to men whose profession requires them to sit in rooms with people who do not wish to hear what they have come to say. "Miss Finch?" he said. "Miss Isobel Finch." "The shop is closed," Isobel said. "We open at 9 tomorrow morning. I am aware of your hours." He removed his hat, revealing hair that was silver at the temples, dark elsewhere, neatly arranged despite the weather. "My name is Callum Drummond. I am a solicitor with the firm of Drummond and Hardy on George Street. I apologize for the lateness of the hour, but the matter I have come about is not, I'm afraid, the sort that keeps well overnight." Isobel looked at him. Solicitors did not come to bookbinders' shops at 9 o'clock on winter evenings unless something had gone wrong, or was about to, or had been wrong for a very long time, and had only just been discovered. She thought of her father. She thought of the debts she had spent 3 months sorting through since his death. She thought of the paperwork she had signed, and the accounts she had closed, and the careful, methodical work of turning one man's unfinished life into something an executor could file and forget. "What matter?" she said. Mr. Drummond reached into his leather case and produced a single sheet of paper, folded once, and held it toward her through the gap in the door. "I represent the estate of Mrs. Helena Blackwood, who passed away 11 days ago in Morningside. Among her effects was a will, a new will, drafted only 6 weeks before her death, which contains a single unusual clause." He paused, the paper still extended, the snow settling on his coat collar like something that had been waiting for permission. "Mrs. Blackwood's will states that a manuscript was left in the care of your father, Mr. Alistair Finch, 20 years ago, in the year 1871. It was brought to this shop to be bound. It was never collected. Mrs. Blackwood's will directs that the manuscript be retrieved and delivered to her heir, her son, who is myself. I am Callum Drummond. I am Helena Blackwood's son." Isobel stared at him. 20 years. She had been 8 years old in 1871. She had been sitting on the floor of this same shop, watching her father stitch signatures into leather covers, learning the names of the tools, the bone folder, the awl, the lying press, before she understood what they were for. "There is no record of that order," she said. "I have been through every ledger my father kept, every commission, every receipt, every note. I closed the accounts 3 months ago. There was nothing outstanding from 1871. There was nothing outstanding at all." Mr. Drummond did not seem surprised. He folded the paper and returned it to his case. "I thought that might be the case," he said quietly, "which means one of 2 things. Either my mother was mistaken, and I knew her well enough to say that she was not a woman given to mistakes about matters she considered important, or your father did not record the commission, and a bookbinder who does not record a commission is a bookbinder who has decided, for reasons of his own, that the commission should not be recorded." The snow fell between them. The gas lamp flickered. Inside the shop, the coal stove ticked softly as it cooled, the sound like a small clock counting down towards something. "May I come in?" Mr. Drummond said. "I believe there is more to discuss than can be managed comfortably on a doorstep in February." Isobel looked at the solicitor, at his patient face, and his careful coat, and the snow accumulating on his shoulders with the unhurried persistence of something that intended to stay. Then she opened the door the rest of the way and stepped aside. "The kettle is still warm," she said. "You had better come in." Edinburgh in February was a city that understood darkness the way desert cities understood heat, not as an imposition, but as a fundamental condition, something woven so deeply into the texture of daily life that to remove it would have been to remove the city's essential character. The sun, when it appeared at all, arrived after 8 and departed before 4, providing a few hours of pale, tentative light that never quite managed to assert itself against the stone and the cloud and the general grey determination of the Scottish winter. The old town climbed upward from the Canongate to the castle in a long, complicated ridge of tenements and closes and wynds that had been accumulating for 600 years, each generation building on what the previous one had left, so that the city rose in layers like geological strata, the newest buildings sitting atop the bones of the oldest, and the streets between them growing narrower and darker with each decade of construction. Victoria Terrace, where Finch and Son occupied the ground floor of a narrow stone building between a stationer's shop and an advocate's chambers, was one of the quieter streets in this densely woven quarter. It ran along the upper edge of the Grassmarket, looking south over the rooftops toward the Pentland Hills, which in winter were visible only on the clearest days, and otherwise existed as a rumour beyond the cloud, a suggestion of elevation at the edge of the world. The shop itself was old enough to have forgotten its own age. The walls were stone, 2 feet thick in places, which meant that summer never quite penetrated, and winter was always present in the mortar. The front room, where customers were received, was dominated by a long oak counter that Alistair Finch had installed in 1862, its surface now marked by 30 years of books set down, measured, discussed, and carried away. Behind the counter, shelves rose to the ceiling, holding completed commissions, waiting for collection, sample bindings in various leathers and cloths, and the tools of the trade arranged with the particular orderliness of a craftsperson who believed that a tidy workshop was a moral statement. The smell of the shop was its most distinctive quality and the thing that visitors remembered longest. It was not a single smell, but a composition. Leather, certainly, the rich, slightly sweet scent of well-tanned calfskin and Morocco, and the sharper, more astringent note of fresh adhesive, and the deep, woody fragrance of paper that had been stored properly, and beneath all of it, like a bass note in a piece of music, the smell of the building itself, old stone and beeswax, and the faint ghost of centuries of coal fires. Isobel had grown up in this smell. She had breathed it every day of her 28 years, first as a child, sitting on the workshop floor while her father worked, then as an apprentice, learning the trade at his side, and now as the sole proprietor of a business that bore her family's name and carried her family's reputation, and depended entirely on her hands. Isobel Finch was not a woman who attracted attention, which was both a limitation and a considerable advantage, depending on the circumstance. She was of medium height, with dark hair that she wore pinned in a practical arrangement that had not changed in 8 years, and that she saw no reason to alter. Her hands were her most notable feature, long-fingered, steady, and marked at the tips with the small calluses and occasional cuts that came from working daily with needles, knives, and the sometimes unpredictable behavior of materials under tension. She had her father's eyes, which were a particular shade of grey-blue that people sometimes described as the colour of the Firth on an overcast morning, and his temperament, which was patient and methodical and capable of sustained attention over very long periods without complaint. These were qualities that made for an excellent bookbinder. They were not, her father had observed, once with more affection than criticism, the qualities that made for an exciting conversationalist. But the world had quite enough exciting conversationalists already, and what it needed more of was people who could sit still and do careful work. Alistair Finch had died in November, 3 months before the solicitor's visit, of a condition the doctor had called a weakness of the heart, which seemed to Isobel an inadequate description of what had actually happened, which was that her father's body had simply decided, after 67 years of steady, unhurried operation, to stop. There had been no drama in it, no crisis. He had been working at his bench on a Tuesday afternoon, stitching the final signature of a volume of Tennyson for a professor at the university, and he had set down his needle and said he thought he might rest for a moment, and he had closed his eyes, and that had been that. Isobel had been in the front room with a customer at the time. She had heard the small sound of the needle being set down, a sound she could identify from 30 feet away, so familiar was she with every noise the workshop produced, and she had known, not immediately, not in any dramatic way, but something in the quality of the silence that followed the setting down of the needle had been different from the usual silence. And she had excused herself from the customer and gone to the back and found him sitting at his bench with his hands in his lap and an expression on his face that was, she thought, peaceful. She had not cried. She had not cried at the funeral either, or in the weeks that followed, during which she had systematically worked through the business of closing her father's personal accounts, settling his modest debts, notifying his customers, and assuming full responsibility for the shop. She did not consider this an indication of emotional deficiency. She considered it an indication of having been raised by Alistair Finch, who had believed that grief, like bookbinding, was best approached with steady hands and a clear head, and that the tears would come when they were ready and not before, and that there was no shame in either their presence or their absence. The tears had not yet come. Isobel was beginning to suspect they might be taking a rather long time about it. She made tea. This was not a gesture of hospitality, so much as a practical necessity. Her hands needed something to do while she absorbed what Mr. Drummond had told her, and the kettle provided that something. She moved through the small kitchen at the back of the workshop with the automatic efficiency of a person performing a task she had performed 10,000 times, measuring tea leaves into the brown pot, pouring water that was still adequately hot from the kettle she had boiled an hour earlier, setting out 2 cups on saucers that did not match because her father had never seen the point of matched crockery. Mr. Drummond sat in the chair beside the coal stove and waited with the patience of a man accustomed to waiting. He had removed his coat, which hung now on the hook by the door, still carrying its freight of melting snow. His case rested on his knees, and his hands rested on the case, and he looked at the workshop around him with the careful, cataloguing attention of someone who was reading the room the way other people read documents. "Your father was a very fine craftsman," he said, his gaze moving along the shelves of tools, the presses, the stacks of uncut boards, the rolls of cloth and leather arranged by color and weight. "I have seen his work. My mother had several volumes he bound for her over the years. She kept them in a glass-fronted case in her study. She was not, in general, a sentimental woman, but she was particular about books." She was a customer. Isobel set the tea on the small table between them. She was, for many years. She would bring him manuscripts. Not her own, you understand, but manuscripts she had acquired. She was a collector, in her way. She collected the unpublished works that had been written but never printed, for reasons that varied. Some were suppressed, some were simply forgotten, some were deliberately hidden by their authors or by the families who survived them. My mother believed that such works deserved preservation, regardless of the reasons they had been kept from the public. Isobel sipped her tea and considered this. She had heard of such collectors, though she had never knowingly served one. They existed in the margins of the publishing world. People who valued the unprinted word not for its commercial potential, but for its historical or literary significance, or sometimes simply for the thrill of possession, the knowledge that they held something the world did not know existed. "And the manuscript she left here in 1871? Isobel asked. Mr. Drummond set down his cup. That is where the story becomes complicated. He opened his case and withdrew a second document. Not the will, but a letter, written on cream-colored paper, in a hand that was elegant, controlled, and distinctly feminine. My mother wrote this letter 6 weeks before she died. It was addressed to me and sealed, with instructions that it should be opened only after her death. I received it 11 days ago. He unfolded it carefully. The paper was good quality, heavy, the kind that held its creases cleanly. He did not read it aloud. Instead, he summarized. In 1871, my mother acquired a manuscript, a novel she calls it, written by a woman. She does not name the author in this letter, but she describes the work as extraordinary. She says it was, in her estimation, the finest piece of fiction she had ever read, and that it had been suppressed, her word, by the author's family, who considered its contents damaging to their reputation. He paused, pressing his lips together in the way of a man choosing his next words with care. My mother brought the manuscript to your father to be properly bound and preserved. She intended to keep it in her collection, but something happened between the commission and the collection. My mother does not say what. She says only that your father wrote to her some weeks after she had left the manuscript and told her that the binding would take longer than anticipated. And then he wrote again some months later and said that he had encountered difficulties with the paper, which required special treatment. And then he stopped writing altogether. And my mother, who was, I must tell you, a woman of considerable pride and not inconsiderable stubbornness, did not pursue the matter. She allowed it to lie for 20 years. That is unlike my father, Isobel said. He was meticulous about correspondence. He never missed a deadline without explanation, and he never left a commission unfinished. Which is precisely why my mother believed the manuscript was still here, Mr. Drummond said. She believed your father had not failed to complete the commission. She believed he had chosen not to complete it. She believed he had kept the manuscript, hidden it perhaps, because he had read it and decided that it should not be bound and returned. That whatever was in those pages was something he felt obligated to protect. The coal stove ticked. Outside, the snow continued its patient accumulation on the ledges and the sills and the cobblestones of Victoria Terrace. Isobel held her teacup in both hands, feeling the warmth move into her palms, and thought about her father, about the ledges she had gone through, column by column, entry by entry, finding everything in perfect order, about the commissions, all completed or returned, about the accounts, all settled, about the 20 years of meticulous records that contained no mention whatsoever of Helena Blackwood or any manuscript from 1871. My father was honest, she said quietly. If he kept something that did not belong to him, he had a reason. I believe he did, Mr. Drummond said, and I believe the reason is somewhere in this building, in a room perhaps that you have not yet found. Isobel did not sleep well that night. This was not unusual. She had not slept well since November, since the sound of the needle being set down on the workbench. But tonight the wakefulness had a different quality. It was not the heavy, formless insomnia of grief, but something sharper, more directed. The restlessness of a mind working on a problem it has not yet fully defined. She lay in her narrow bed in the room above the shop and listened to the building. Old buildings spoke at night in languages that only their long-term inhabitants understood. The settling of stone as the temperature dropped, the particular creak of the third stair, which her father had never repaired because he said it served as a useful alarm against intruders, the tap of the pipe in the wall when the water in it contracted, the faint, intermittent scratch of the branch from the elder tree in the courtyard against the workshop window, a sound she had known since childhood, and which she had always found more companionable than disturbing. She thought about the ledgers. She had gone through them with the thoroughness that was, she supposed, both her inheritance and her habit. Every page, every entry, from the most recent commission back to the first one her father had recorded when he opened the shop in 1862. She had found nothing irregular, nothing missing, no gaps in the chronology, no suspiciously blank pages, no entries that had been altered or removed. But Mr. Drummond's suggestion had introduced a different possibility. Not that something was missing from the ledgers, but that something had never been entered in the first place. A commission so sensitive, so deliberately kept apart from the ordinary business of the shop, that her father had not recorded it at all. She rose at 5, which was her usual hour, and dressed in the dark, and went downstairs and lit the stove and put the kettle on, and stood at the workshop window while the water heated, looking at the courtyard and the elder tree and the snow that had accumulated in the night, smooth and untouched on the cobblestones. The dawn was still more than an hour away. The sky above the rooftops was the particular deep blue-black of a Scottish February morning, and the gas lamps along Victoria Terrace made their amber spheres in the dark, each one surrounded by a small halo of mist. She began in the workshop. She did not begin with any expectation of finding something quickly. She began because beginning was what you did when you had a problem, and because she had been trained by a man who believed that the solution to most difficulties was patient, systematic attention. The workshop was a room she knew intimately. Every shelf, every cupboard, every drawer and cubbyhole, a niche that 30 years of occupation had produced. She knew where her father kept his best tools, and where he kept the tools he used only rarely. She knew which drawers stuck in damp weather and which cupboards had locks that no longer worked. She knew the arrangement of the leather rolls by color and weight, and the system her father had used for organizing his thread, and the particular logic of his filing system, which had made perfect sense to him and required considerable study by anyone else. She searched for 3 hours that morning before the shop opened. She searched methodically, beginning at the eastern wall and working westward, examining each shelf and drawer and cupboard, not just for a hidden manuscript, but for anything that seemed out of place, anything that did not belong to the ordinary inventory of a bookbinder's workshop. She found nothing. She opened the shop at 9 and served 3 customers during the morning: a bookseller from the lawn market collecting a repaired set of Scott, a university student bringing a dissertation for binding, and old Mrs. L. Carmichael, who came every Tuesday to have her Bible's loose pages reattached, and who stayed for 20 minutes to discuss the sermon from the previous Sunday. And between customers she returned to the search. By noon she had examined every accessible space in the workshop and the front room. She had opened cabinets she had not opened in years. She had moved boxes that had not been moved since her father placed them. She had checked behind the shelving units and beneath the workbenches and inside the lining press, which was large enough to conceal a considerable volume, but which contained nothing except the pressing boards it was designed to hold. She sat at her workbench during the lunch hour and ate the bread and cheese she had brought from upstairs, and thought about her father. She thought about the way he had arranged this shop, the logic of it, the care. She thought about the back wall of the workshop, where the heaviest equipment stood, the lying press, the board cutter, the nipping press, and the large built-in shelf unit that occupied the entire wall from floor to ceiling, filled with paper stock, board, cloth, leather, and the various materials of the trade. She thought about the fact that the shelf unit was built into the wall, not placed against it, built into it. She had never questioned this. It was simply part of the workshop, as permanent and unremarkable as the floor or the ceiling. But now, sitting at her workbench with Mr. Drummond's words in her mind, a room, perhaps that you have not yet found, she looked at the shelf unit with new eyes and saw what she had never thought to look for. The wall behind the shelves was stone. The building was stone throughout, but the shelf unit itself was wood, good oak, well constructed, fitted tightly into the alcove that the stone walls formed. And the alcove was deeper than the shelves required. She could see this now, measuring with her eye the depth of the shelves against the apparent depth of the alcove, and finding a discrepancy of perhaps 18 inches. 18 inches of space between the back of the shelves and the stone wall behind them. 18 inches was not nothing. 18 inches was enough. It took her the rest of the afternoon to clear the shelf unit. She worked alone, having closed the shop early with a sign on the door that said, "Family Matter, reopening tomorrow," which was the first time in her memory that the shop had closed during business hours for any reason other than a death or a public holiday. The materials were heavy. Paper stock, especially, was deceptively weighty, and there were dozens of reams of it in various weights and colors, each of which had to be removed, set carefully on the floor or on the workbenches, and catalogued in her mind so that it could be returned to its proper place. The leather rolls were easier. She simply carried them to the front room and laid them on the counter. The board and cloth went onto the floor in orderly stacks. By 4 o'clock, the shelf unit was empty. She stood before it in the lamplight. The February afternoon had already gone dark, and examined the back panels. They were oak, like the rest of the unit, but thinner than the shelves themselves, which was consistent with their function as a backing rather than a structural element. She ran her hands along the panels, feeling for any irregularity, any gap or seam that might indicate a hidden mechanism. She found it at the bottom of the third panel from the left, a small brass catch, recessed into the wood so that it was flush with the surface and invisible unless you were specifically looking for it. It was the kind of catch that a skilled craftsman would install, precise, elegant, designed to be found only by someone who knew it was there. Isobel pressed the catch. There was a soft click, the sound of a mechanism releasing after a very long stillness, and the panel shifted inward by half an inch. She pressed it further. It swung open on concealed hinges, revealing a space behind it that was dark and cold, and smelled of old paper and dust, and something else, something she could not immediately name, but which reminded her, with a sudden and unexpected force, of her father. She held the lamp up and looked into the space. It was not large, perhaps 6 feet wide, 4 feet deep, and the full height of the shelf unit, about 7 feet. The walls were stone, the floor was stone, and the air was cold, in the way that enclosed stone spaces are cold, not aggressively, but with a patient, settled quality that suggested the cold had been there a very long time and had no intention of leaving. The space contained a small table, a writing desk really, of the kind that folded flat and could be stored or carried. It was open now, its surface covered with a cloth that had once been green and was now the color of old moss. On the cloth sat 3 things: a lamp, unlit, with oil still in its reservoir, a leather-bound journal, closed with a brass clasp, and beside the journal a stack of manuscripts, not one, but several, each wrapped in muslin cloth and tied with cotton twine, arranged in a neat row with the careful precision of things that had been placed there by someone who cared very much about their preservation. Isobel counted them. There were 9 manuscripts, wrapped and tied and stored in a hidden room behind a bookbinder's shelf unit, where they had waited. She did the arithmetic without thinking. For 20 years. She reached for the journal first. The journal was her father's. She knew this before she opened it. From the leather, he had always preferred a particular grade of calfskin for his personal books, slightly thicker than what he used for customers, and from the brass clasp, which was the same kind he used on the sample bindings he kept in the shop window. He had bound this journal himself, which meant it was something he valued, something that mattered to him in the particular way that a bookbinder's personal work always matters, as both object and intention. She opened the clasp and turned to the first page. The handwriting was his. She would have known it anywhere. The slight forward lean, the careful spacing, the particular way he formed his capital letters with a small flourish at the baseline that he had never quite abandoned despite years of trying. He had told her once that his handwriting was the last remnant of his youthful vanity, and that he kept the flourishes because they reminded him that he had once been young enough to care about such things. The first entry was dated March 14th, 1871. She read slowly, as she did everything, with the full, steady attention that was both her inheritance and her habit. And as she read, the small hidden room grew warmer around her. Not physically, the stone remained cold, but in the way that spaces grow warmer when they are occupied by someone who belongs in them, someone who has been awaited. The journal told a story, not all at once, not in a single narrative, but in the way that journals tell stories, in fragments, in entries made at intervals of days or weeks, or sometimes months, each one a snapshot of a mind working through something difficult. Her father had been a careful writer, not eloquent exactly, but precise, choosing his words with the same attention he gave to choosing leather or thread. He wrote about Helena Blackwood's first visit to the shop in February of 1871. She had come alone, which was itself unusual for a woman of her standing, carrying a manuscript wrapped in brown paper. She had asked him to bind it, properly, she had said, in full leather, with gold tooling on the spine. She had been specific about the binding. She wanted it to last. He had unwrapped the manuscript that evening after the shop closed. This was his custom. He always examined a manuscript before beginning work to assess the paper, the ink, the condition, the requirements. He had expected a novel of the ordinary sort, the kind that women of means sometimes had privately bound for their personal libraries. What he had found was not ordinary. The manuscript was a novel, yes, but it was a novel of such extraordinary quality. Her father used the word extraordinary twice in the same entry, which for a man who distrusted superlatives was itself extraordinary. That he had sat at his workbench and read the first 50 pages without moving, and then had gone upstairs and made tea and come back down and read another 50. And by midnight he had finished the entire work and was sitting in the dark with the manuscript in his lap and a feeling in his chest that he described, with characteristic understatement, as considerable. The novel was about Edinburgh, about a woman, a governess, her father noted, who discovers that the family she works for is concealing a crime that implicates some of the city's most prominent citizens. The writing was, her father said, unlike anything he had encountered. It had the precision of legal testimony and the beauty of poetry, and it told a truth about Edinburgh's respectable society that was both devastating and, he believed, entirely accurate. He did not name the author, not in this entry, not in any subsequent entry. He referred to her only as the writer, which Isobel found both frustrating and, as she read further, entirely consistent with her father's character. He was protecting someone. He had been protecting someone for 20 years. Over the following week, Isobel read her father's journal from beginning to end and examined each of the 9 manuscripts in the hidden room. She did this in the evenings after the shop closed, sitting at the small table with the lamp lit and the cold pressing in from the stone walls. Wrapped in her father's work apron for warmth, because it was the heaviest garment she could find in the workshop, and because wearing it made her feel, in some way she did not examine too closely, less alone. The journal revealed its story gradually, the way all true stories reveal themselves, not in a single dramatic disclosure, but through the accumulation of details, each one adding depth and context to what had come before. Helena Blackwood had brought the first manuscript in February of 1871. She had brought the second in April, the third in June. By the end of that year she had brought 5, and by the end of 1873, 9. All were novels, all were by the same author, and all her father wrote were remarkable, not merely competent or interesting, but genuinely, disturbingly good. The kind of work that, had it been published, would have altered the literary landscape of its time. The author was a woman named Catherine Moncrieff. Her father wrote the name once, in an entry dated November 1873, as if he had finally decided that the journal deserved to know, and then never wrote it again. Catherine Moncrieff had been, he noted, the daughter of Lord Moncrieff, a senior judge of the Court of Session, and one of Edinburgh's most powerful and most conservative public figures. Catherine had written her novels in secret, over a period of years, in a room at the top of her father's house in the new town, working at night after the household had retired. She had given the manuscripts to Helena Blackwood, who was a distant relation and a woman she trusted, with instructions that they be preserved, but not published. Not yet, not while her father lived. Lord Moncrieff's views on women and writing were, Catherine had said, well known and non-negotiable. He believed that women who wrote fiction were morally suspect, and that women who wrote fiction about the failings of respectable society were something worse. He would not merely disapprove, he would destroy the manuscripts if he found them. He might destroy Catherine. Helena had brought them to Alistair Finch because she trusted his craft and his discretion. But Alistair, having read the first novel, had understood something that Helena had not yet grasped. The manuscripts were not merely remarkable literature, they were evidence. Catherine's novels drew so closely from the actual lives and actual crimes of Edinburgh's ruling class that they could not be published without identifying the people they described, and some of those people were powerful enough to ensure that publication never happened. Catherine had written her novels in secret, over a period of years, in a room at the top of her father's house in the new town, working at night after the household had retired. She had given the manuscripts to Helena Blackwood, who was a distant relation and a woman she trusted, with instructions that they be preserved, but not published. Not yet, not while her father lived. Lord Moncrieff's views on women and writing were, Catherine had said, well known and non-negotiable. He believed that women who wrote fiction were morally suspect, and that women who wrote fiction about the failings of respectable society were something worse. He would not merely disapprove, he would destroy the manuscripts if he found them. He might destroy Catherine. Helena had brought them to Alistair Finch because she trusted his craft and his discretion. But Alistair, having read the first novel, had understood something that Helena had not yet grasped. The manuscripts were not merely remarkable literature, they were evidence. Catherine's novels drew so closely from the actual lives and actual crimes of Edinburgh's ruling class that they could not be published without identifying the people they described, and some of those people were powerful enough to ensure that publication never happened. She did not go upstairs that night. She sat in the hidden room with the journal and the manuscripts and the cold stone walls, and she thought about her father. She had known him for 28 years. She had worked beside him for 12 of those years. She had shared his meals, his workshop, his silences, his occasional dry humor, his deep and abiding love of well-made books. She had believed she knew him completely, not in the way that one knows a public figure from the outside, through reputation and report, but from the inside, through the daily accumulation of thousands of small shared moments. She had been wrong, not entirely wrong. The man she had known was real, was genuinely who he was, but he had contained within him a secret of this magnitude, a hidden room both literal and figurative. and he had maintained it for 20 years without a single word, a single slip, a single moment in which the weight of it had shown on his face or in his manner. She felt something shift in her understanding of him, the way a building shifts when a wall is removed, not collapsing but redistributing its weight, finding a new configuration of load and support. Her father was not diminished by this revelation. If anything, he was enlarged. The man who had sat at his workbench day after day, year after year, binding books with quiet precision, had also been a man who had built a hidden room and filled it with the suppressed words of a woman he had never met, because he believed those words mattered, because he understood that some things are worth protecting, even when the protection costs you something, even when no one will ever know what you have done. She thought about Catherine Moncrief, writing alone at night in a room at the top of a house in the new town, producing work of extraordinary quality in absolute secrecy, knowing that her father would destroy it if he found it, knowing that the world might never read it, writing anyway. Writing because the words existed inside her and demanded to be set down, because the truth she had to tell was more important than the danger of telling it. She thought about Helena Blackwood, collecting the manuscripts, carrying them across the city in the dark, entrusting them to a bookbinder on Victoria Terrace, and then waiting. 20 years of waiting, 20 years of knowing the manuscripts were out there somewhere, alive and unread, their author's voice preserved but inaudible. 3 people, 3 acts of quiet, persistent, profoundly unglamorous courage. No confrontations, no public stands, no dramatic gestures, just the steady, daily work of protecting something that the powerful wished to destroy. Isobel looked at the 9 manuscripts in their muslin wrappings, arranged in their neat row on the green cloth. 9 novels by a woman whose name she had not known an hour ago. 9 novels that her father had spent 20 years hiding. 9 novels that Mr. Drummond, Helena Blackwood's son, Catherine Moncrief's heir by proxy, had come to collect. And she thought, what happens now? Mr. Drummond returned on Thursday evening, as they had arranged. The snow had not stopped since Tuesday, and Edinburgh lay beneath a thick white silence that muffled the usual sounds of the city and made everything feel closer, more intimate, as if the world had drawn its boundaries inward. Isobel met him at the door and led him through the shop and the workshop to the hidden room, which she had left exactly as she had found it, the manuscripts untouched in their wrappings, the journal open to the first page. She had added only a second lamp and a chair so that they could both sit. Mr. Drummond stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the room. His face, which had been composed and professional at their first meeting, was different now. The composure was still there, but something had come through it, the way light comes through a curtain that is not quite thick enough. A warmth, a vulnerability, a quality of feeling that he had not permitted himself to show before. "She never told me," he said, quietly. "My mother. She never told me about any of this. Not the manuscripts, not Catherine, not your father. She kept it all. She kept it all for 20 years, and she never said a word until the will." Isobel waited. She had learned from her father and from 12 years of working with customers, who sometimes needed to say things before they could hear things, that waiting was often more useful than speaking. "My mother was not a cold woman," Mr. Drummond continued, moving into the room and sitting carefully in the chair Isobel had provided. "But she was private, intensely private. She believed that the things that mattered most should be kept closest, and that sharing them was a form of risk she was not always willing to take. I think," he paused, "I think she kept this secret not because she was afraid, but because she loved it." because it was the most important thing in her life, and she could not bear the thought of it being diminished by exposure to the world's indifference. He looked at the manuscripts. "May I?" Isobel nodded. He reached for the nearest one and carefully untied the twine and unfolded the muslin. Inside was a stack of paper, perhaps 300 pages, handwritten in a close, neat hand, the ink slightly faded, but perfectly legible. The first page bore a title, "The Governess of Drummond Place." Mr. Drummond read the title and went very still. "Drummond Place," he said. "That is where the Moncrief family lived. That is where Catherine wrote." "Your mother chose your name carefully," Isobel observed. He looked at her, and she saw in his eyes the same recognition she had felt reading her father's journal, the sudden, disorienting understanding that someone you loved had contained depths you had never suspected. "She chose it very carefully," he agreed. "My full name is Callum Drummond. C.D. Catherine's initials were C.M. My mother's maiden name was Moncrief. She was Catherine's cousin." The silence that followed this was long and full, the kind of silence that occurs when a story that has been accumulating for decades reaches the point where all its separate threads converge into a single, coherent pattern. "Catherine Moncrief was my aunt," Mr. Drummond said, "and these manuscripts are my inheritance." They sat in the hidden room until midnight, reading, not the manuscripts themselves, that would take weeks, months perhaps, but the journal which Isobel showed him page by page, her father's careful handwriting recording the story that 3 people had lived and 1 had died without ever telling. Catherine Moncrief had died in 1879. Her father wrote about it in a single entry, spare and precise. "The writer is gone. Fever, they say." She was 41. The manuscripts remain. "I do not know what to do with them now, except what I have been doing. I will keep them. I will wait." He had waited 12 more years. He had waited until his own death, and the waiting had become the manuscript's second protective shell, the first being the muslin and twine, the second being the silence of a man who understood that sometimes the best thing you can do for a story is to keep it safe until the world is ready to hear it. At midnight, Isobel made more tea. They sat in the workshop this time, at the workbench where her father had spent his days, surrounded by the tools and materials of his trade. And Mr. Drummond told her about Catherine. She had been, he said, the kind of woman who filled a room not by being loud or commanding, but by the quality of her attention. She listened to everything. She noticed details that other people overlooked, the way a servant held a tray, the particular silence that fell over a dinner table when a certain topic was raised, the small involuntary movements of hands and faces that revealed what words concealed. She had been educated privately, as women of her class were, but she had educated herself far beyond what her tutors provided, reading voraciously in her father's library, which was extensive and which Lord Moncrief never thought to restrict, because it did not occur to him that a daughter might read philosophy and law and history with the same seriousness as a son. She began writing at 20, Mr. Drummond said. She told my mother that the writing came from the same place as the observing, that she could not help noticing things, and she could not help recording them, and that the recording naturally took the shape of stories, because stories were the form in which truth was most bearable. And most bearable, Isobel repeated. Her word. My mother quoted it often. Catherine believed that truth told directly, as accusation, as polemic, as argument, could be deflected, denied, dismissed, But truth told as a story entered through a different door. It bypassed the defenses that people constructed against uncomfortable knowledge. A reader who would reject a pamphlet might accept a novel, because the novel asked for nothing except attention. And by the time the reader understood what the attention had revealed to them, it was too late to unknow it. The coal stove ticked. The elder tree scratched at the window. The gas lamp on the workbench cast its steady amber light over the tools and the leather and the thread, and the two people sitting in the quiet of a bookbinder's shop at midnight in February, holding between them the accumulated weight of 30 years of hidden words. "What will you do with them?" Isobel asked. Mr. Drummond looked at his hands. They were Solicitor's hands, clean and precise, but she noticed now that the fingers were long, like hers, the fingers of someone who might have been skilled with tools if their life had taken a different direction. "I want to publish them," he said. "Catherine is dead. Lord Moncrief is dead. He died in 1884. The people the novels describe are dead or old or no longer in positions to be damaged by whatever truths they contain. The danger that your father protected against has passed. The only thing that remains is the work itself, and the work deserves to be read." He looked at Isobel. "But I cannot publish them unbound. They need a bookbinder. They need to be properly prepared, the pages assessed, the paper treated if necessary, clean copies made for the printer, and the originals bound and preserved as they were always meant to be. Your father began this work 20 years ago and could not finish it. I would like you to finish it." Isobel thought about this. She thought about her father, sitting at this bench, holding the first manuscript in his hands, and understanding that he held something extraordinary. She thought about the hidden room he had built with his own hands, working alone, in secret, with the same patience and skill he brought to every binding. She thought about Catherine Moncrief, writing alone at night, producing work that deserved to exist, trusting that it would find its way to the world when the world was ready. And she thought about herself, 28 years old, sitting in her father's chair, in her father's shop, with her father's tools around her, and her father's unfinished work before her. "Yes," she said, "I will bind them." She began the next morning, not with the binding itself, that would come later, after careful preparation, but with the reading. A bookbinder who did not read the work she was binding was, her father had always said, no better than a carpenter who did not look at the wood. The material had to be understood before it could be honored. She started with The Governess of Drummond Place, the first novel, the one that had stopped her father in his tracks 20 years ago. She read it at the workbench, the manuscript propped on a reading stand, turning the pages with the careful, clean-fingered touch of someone who understood that these pages were irreplaceable. She read for 3 hours that first morning, and understood, within the first 20 pages, what her father had meant by extraordinary. The writing had a quality she had encountered in very few works, a clarity that was not simplicity, a depth that was not obscurity, a voice that seemed to speak not from the page, but from somewhere behind it, from the place where truth lives before it finds its words. Catherine Moncrief had written about Edinburgh the way a surgeon writes about the body, with intimate knowledge, with precision, with a kind of love that does not spare. Isobel read. The shop stayed closed that day, and the next, and the next. She put a new sign on the door, closed for restoration work. She read each novel in order, taking notes in a new notebook she had started for the purpose, recording the condition of each manuscript, the quality of the paper, the state of the ink, the particular requirements each would need for binding. Mr. Drummond visited every evening. He brought food, since Isobel tended to forget to eat when she was absorbed in work, and they sat in the workshop, and she told him what she had read. and he told her what he remembered of Catherine. And between them, the woman who had written these words began to take shape, not as a historical figure, not as an abstraction, but as a person. Complex, determined, funny in unexpected moments, devastatingly observant, stubborn in ways that had cost her dearly, and gifted with a talent that the world had never been permitted to recognize. The binding itself, when Isobel began it in March, was the most careful work she had ever done. She chose the leather herself, full calfskin, a deep blue-black that Catherine would have appreciated for its severity and its depth. She cut the boards and measured the spines and prepared the signatures with the slow, deliberate attention that her father had taught her, and that she now understood, for the first time, as not merely professional skill, but a form of devotion. She tooled the spines in gold. She lettered the titles. She set each volume to dry in the press with the quiet satisfaction of work done correctly, work that would last. She was, she understood, completing her father's commission. 20 years late, but complete. In April, when the first 3 volumes were bound, and the remaining 6 were in various stages of preparation, Mr. Drummond brought a woman to the shop. She was perhaps 60, small and upright, with white hair arranged in a style that was neither fashionable nor unfashionable, but simply itself, and eyes that moved around the workshop with the quick, appreciative attention of someone who knew what she was looking at. Her name was Mrs. Agnes Livingstone, and she was, Mr. Drummond explained, a publisher. Not a large publisher. She operated from a modest office on the Royal Mile, producing works of Scottish history and literature in small editions that were sold through a select group of booksellers in Edinburgh, Glasgow, and London. She was known, among those who knew of her at all, for the quality of her books and the independence of her judgment. "Callum tells me you have something I should see," Mrs. Livingstone said, settling herself in the chair by the stove with the ease of a woman who was comfortable in workshops and did not require ceremony. "He has been remarkably vague about what it is, which in my experience means it is either very good or very bad. Show me." Isobel brought her the first bound volume. Mrs. Livingstone took it, examined the binding with a brief, expert glance that took in the quality of the leather, the precision of the tooling, the straightness of the spine, and then opened it and began to read. She read for 40 minutes without speaking. Isobel made tea. Mr. Drummond sat in the corner and said nothing, though Isobel noticed that his hands, resting on his leather case, were not entirely still. When Mrs. Livingstone looked up, her expression had changed. The professional assessment was still there, but something else had joined it, something brighter, more urgent, the expression of a person who has found what they have been looking for, without knowing they were looking for it. "Where has this been?" she said. "Hidden," Isobel said, "for 20 years. In a room behind my workshop wall." Mrs. Livingstone looked at the book in her hands, then at Isobel, then at Mr. Drummond, then back at the book. "This is extraordinary," she said, and the same word her father had used, the same word that seemed to be the only word adequate to Catherine Moncrieff's work, settled in the room like something that had been waiting to be said. "I will publish it," Mrs. Livingstone said. "All 9. I will need a year, perhaps longer, but I will publish them, and I will publish them properly, with the author's name on the cover, and a preface that tells the world who she was and why these books were hidden, and who kept them safe. Every name: Alistair Finch, Helena Blackwood, and yours, Miss Finch, the bookbinder who completed the commission, on a Tuesday evening in May, with the last of the 9 volumes bound and pressed, and standing in a row on the shelf in the hidden room, which Isobel had decided to keep, not as a hiding place any longer, but as a kind of memorial, a small shrine to the work of preservation that her father had undertaken. Isobel sat at the workbench and opened her father's journal to the last entry. She had been saving it, not deliberately, not with any conscious plan, but in the way that you save the last chapter of a book you love, not because you don't want to finish it, but because you want to be ready for the ending, to receive it properly, with the attention it deserves. The entry was dated September 1891, 2 months before his death. The handwriting was slightly less steady than the earlier entries, the letters a fraction larger, the pressure on the page a fraction lighter, but it was still recognizably his. The forward lean, the flourishes on the capitals, the precise spacing. It read, "I have been thinking about the manuscripts. I have been thinking about them more than usual, which may be because I am thinking about many things more than usual, or it may be because I have begun to understand that I will not be the one to see this finished. The work will pass to someone else. I hope it will pass to Isobel, though I have not told her about the room or the manuscripts or any of it, and I am not certain I will. She is the finest bookbinder I have ever trained, and I include myself in that comparison without false modesty. Her hands are steadier than mine, her eye is sharper, and she possesses a quality I have never quite managed, a patience that is not resignation, but genuine contentment with the pace of careful work. She will know what to do with what I have left behind. She may be angry that I did not tell her. She will be right to be angry, but I think she will also understand, because she is my daughter, and she knows me, that some things must be kept in silence until the silence is no longer necessary, and then they must be spoken. I have done the keeping. She will do the speaking. This is, I think, how things are meant to work. One generation builds the room, the next opens the door. Isobel read these words in the lamplight, in the workshop that smelled of leather and paper and beeswax, in the building where she had been born and raised and taught, and she understood at last what her father had been protecting, not just the manuscripts, not just Catherine Moncrieff's voice, but the possibility itself, the possibility that a woman's words, however dangerous, however suppressed, however long delayed, could survive, could wait in the dark for 20 years and emerge, intact and extraordinary, into the light. The tears came then. They came the way her father had said they would, when they were ready, not before, and they fell onto the open pages of the journal, and Isobel let them fall without wiping them away, because they were, in their way, a form of ink, marking the place where one story ended and another began. The novels of Catherine Moncrieff were published in 1893 by Mrs. Agnes Livingston in 9 volumes, bound in the deep blue-black calfskin that Isobel Finch had chosen, and tooled with gold lettering on the spines. The preface, written by Mr. Callum Drummond, told the full story. Catherine's secret writing, Helena Blackwood's collection, Alistair Finch's hidden room, and Isobel's completion of the work her father had begun. The novels were reviewed in every major Edinburgh newspaper and in several London publications. The reviews were, without exception, astonished. Catherine Moncrieff was compared to George Eliot, to the Brontes, to writers whose names had been part of the language for decades. She was called the greatest Scottish novelist of her century. She was called, at last, by her own name. Isobel Finch continued to run the bookbinding shop on Victoria Terrace for another 34 years, until her retirement in 1925, at the age of 62. She was known throughout Edinburgh as a bookbinder of exceptional skill and absolute integrity. She kept the hidden room, She showed it, occasionally to people she trusted, to apprentices who needed to understand what the craft was for, to scholars who came to study Catherine's original manuscripts, which Isobel had donated to the university library, and to the occasional visitor who simply needed to stand in a small stone room behind a bookbinder's shelves and understand that some things are worth 20 years of silence. Mr. Drummond visited the shop every Thursday evening for the rest of his life. They drank tea, they discussed books, they sat in the quiet of the workshop, in the amber light and the smell of leather and paper, and they did not need to say very much, because they had said between them everything that needed to be said, and what remained was simply the companionship of two people who understood the same important thing. One generation builds the room, the next opens the door, and the words survive. And now, dear listener, let the story settle around you like a quilt drawn close on a winter evening. Let it rest in your mind the way manuscripts rest in their wrappings, quiet, patient, safe. The shop is closed for the night. The gas lamp has been turned to its lowest setting, casting a soft amber glow on the shelves and the tools and the leather-bound volumes standing in their neat rows. The coal stove breathes its slow, warm breath in the corner, and the elder tree in the courtyard taps gently against the window, keeping time with the wind. Edinburgh is settling into sleep around you. The snow has stopped falling, and the city lies beneath its white blanket, still and beautiful, the spires and the rooftops dusted with silver in the faint light of the gas lamps along the empty streets. The castle stands dark against a sky that is clearing slowly, stars appearing one by one, cold and very far away. Let your breathing slow now, matching the rhythm of the city's quiet. In and out, steady and even, like the tick of the coal stove, like the gentle scratch of the branch against the glass. You are safe. You are warm. The door is locked. The fire is banked. The manuscripts are bound and shelved, and waiting for morning, waiting for the readers who will come and open them and find inside the words that someone, long ago, believed were worth preserving. Let your body grow heavier in the bed. Let your thoughts drift like snow, slowly, without direction, without urgency, settling where they will. The bookbinder has finished her work for the day. The tools are clean. The leather is stored. The needle and thread are set aside. Everything is in its place. Everything is as it should be. Sleep now. Rest well. Good night.